Right, so hopefully you all can see my screen now. I can't actually see or hear you anymore, so it's always a little bit of a weird experience for me. So I hope this is all going okay, and I will begin the presentation. So welcome, as I said, my name is Esther Freeman. I'm the project manager for Women Activists of East London, which is a project that is run by Share UK. And I want to begin today's protest talking about how even when women make history, it's pretty hard for them to be remembered for it. And to give you some stats around that, only 17% of articles about notable people on Wikipedia are about women. Only 14% of blue plaques are dedicated to women. And a very poignant stat at the moment, I think, is only 1 in 5 statues are dedicated to women. And I think the numbers of those dedicated to women of colour is probably even tiny percentage of that. So who does get remembered? So some of you, we're just going to move across to the US for a while. Some of you may know the name Susan B. Anthony, who is very well known for her leading role in the suffrage movement in the US. However, it's less well known that Susan B. Anthony did not support Black women getting the vote. There was a women's suffrage parade in Washington in 1913, and she actually tried to bar women of colour from the parade completely. But leading Black activist Ida B. Wells argued that it was unconstitutional, and eventually they agreed to admit them, but they told them they had to march at the back. However, this photo shows Ida. She's the one in the middle looking quite proud of herself, and rightly so, because she had managed to sneak into the front. She wasn't going to march at the back. And I share this story because this was happening in the UK as well. So some of you, I'm sure, recognise this picture of Emmeline Pankhurst, who was described by some East London suffragettes at the time as a bourgeois suffragette. So in the early days of the Women's Social Political Union, which was run by Emmeline and her eldest daughter, Christabel, in the earliest days, Christabel was actually still finishing her law degree, and the middle daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, was given the role of honorary secretary, and she set up a number of branches in East London. But when her sister Christabel finished her studies and took over, support from these groups, and there were about 5 at the time across East London, that support was gradually withdrawn. And just like in America with the Black women, working class East London suffragettes were asked to march at the back of marches. The reason given at the time was supposedly for their protection, but records show they clearly didn't believe that. Adelaide Knight, here we are, we've got a picture of Adelaide here, with her husband, Donald Adolphus Brown. Very interesting couple, as you can see from the picture, or I hope you can see from the picture, it's quite an old tatty one, but they are a mixed race couple. And Donald was incredibly progressive and liberal-minded and helped Adelaide out with the housework at home, including the laundry, which was seen as quite scandalous. And he also took her name. So they're absolutely fascinating couple. She became secretary of the Canning Town branch of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the first branch, East London branch, to be set up. And she was absolutely furious with what was going on, particularly this march where they were told to march to the back. And she resigned her position in protest in 1910. And the branch closed soon afterwards due to, and they cited lack of support. And all other East London branches closed down pretty soon afterwards. And there would be no presence in East London again until 1914, which was when Sylvia had split from the Women's Social and Political Union, and she came back to East London and set up the East London Federation of Suffragettes, who we'll talk about a bit more. So Christabel Pankhurst said, quote, "A working women's movement was of no value. Working women were the weakest portion of the sex. How could it be otherwise? Their lives were too hard, their education too meagre to equip them for the struggle." And Emmeline and Christabel, which a lot of people don't realise now, they only campaigned for the vote on the same terms as men, which at that time would have left around 40% of working women out of the franchise. And certainly that's what we saw in 1918 when some women were granted the vote. It did leave out working class women. So another example of where elite women have presided over the narrative is the Matchwomen. So just, I'm sure lots of people know the story of the Matchwomen, but those who don't, the Bryant and May match factory in Bow was well known for its very long working hours and terrible working conditions. The most notable was a condition called phossy jaw, which the women would develop from working with the white phosphorus, and it literally caused their jaw to melt off and was terminal. But there were lots of other things about the amount they were being paid and fines that they had to pay. And Annie Besant wrote an article in a socialist newspaper called White Slavery, and this led to the sacking of some of the whistleblowers, and as a result the women went out on strike. And it's a phenomenal strike, like over 2,000 women walked out and pretty much brought the place to a standstill. Now, Annie Besant, partly because she wrote that article, but partly because she's also a white middle-class woman, she got cited as leading the women out on strike. But according to Dr. Louise Raw, she actually opposed the strike because she didn't think the women would win. What we found was that the women went out on strike anyway. Annie Besant preferred a boycott of the Bryant and May products, but the women went out on strike anyway. And to her credit, she did then support them and help to fundraise, but they did a lot of fundraising themselves, like just walking up and their stand on the streets. And there was a lot of solidarity between the women, because one of the reasons Annie didn't support the strike was she said other women will just come and take your jobs. But they didn't. They stood in solidarity with each other. The strike held out. Now, we didn't used to know much about the women, but through researchers like Louise Raw, we have now been learning a bit more about them. And one of the ones we know a bit about now is Sarah Chapman, and I always forget which one in this photo she is. I think she's the one in the middle with the hat and the neckerchief on. Sarah was unlike many of the other women in the factory, in that she could read and write, and she is thought to have written the letter to Annie asking for her support. She also sat on the strike committee, and she was probably one of nearly 60 women who went to Parliament to talk to the MP, and she later became very active in the TUC. I think actually I do have a photo. Yes, here we are. Annie's there, one there circled in red. So the following year saw the Great Dock Strike, so this is 1889, which saw 100,000 workers out on strike, and it paved the way for new unionism, which was a huge rise in union membership, union activity, which really started to change the way that people worked and the labour rights movement in general. And I think, you know, it's fair to say that the dockers lit the frame for new unionism, but it was the Matchwomen who struck the first match, if you pardon the pun. And not everyone agrees with this, but there is very clear evidence for it. Ben Tillett, one of the leading members of the Dockers Union, he actually credits the Matchwomen in some of his speeches. I mean, it's actually written down. So it's quite interesting that he has credited them, but some modern historians don't credit these women. So our next woman I want to talk about, who's been a bit lost in history, is Sarah Wesker. Some of you may have heard of the playwright Arnold Wesker. Well, Sarah was his aunt. And she was a formidable figure, but she's so lost that we don't even actually have a photo of her. I've looked everywhere. So we have this rather lovely illustration done of her. So who was she? She was the founder of the United Clothing Workers Trade Union, And she led several strikes in major textile factories in East London in the 20s and mobilised hundreds of women workers. She combined communist politics with Yiddishkeit, which is a Jewishness, that Eastern European migrants had brought to the East End. She was active at a time when women trade unionists were extremely rare, and male union representatives saw women's rights as peripheral or even a block to the mass unemployment of the time. So women like Sarah were fighting capitalism and patriarchy. She made huge progress in organising women workers. But despite this, she is often overshadowed by her nephew, who became a famous playwright. But actually, one of his plays, Chicken Soup with Barley, is actually based on his aunt. Another area where women were on the forefront was the housing rights movement, and this because they found themselves in the unique position of being at home when often the men were out at work. So they were the one who were facing the bailiffs and the landlords, and eventually, as the demonstration escalated, the police. So there was a very big rise in housing protests in the 30s because rents had got so out of whack with what was considered legally right, but also what people could afford. So the women started organising rent strikes. They helped resist, they came together in solidarity to resist evictions, and in some cases facing off harassment from the landlords, goons, and also the police. One of the organisations that was extremely successful in this was the Stepney Tenants Defence League, and we don't have a huge amount of information about this woman, but Ella Donovan was actually one of the key organisers in that movement, and she was described as being a very typical of East End women, a very unassuming, quiet woman who achieved huge amounts, and actually they helped reclaim thousands of pounds in unfair rents for tenants. Moving forward now to the 60s and 70s, we're seeing now a huge wave of immigration, new immigration, I should say, because East London has always seen immigration. But this time it is from Central Asian countries, particularly Bangladesh. So this woman you're seeing in the slide here, her name is Mala. Mala Sen, and she came to London in the 60s. She was actually born in India, and she was absolutely stunned when she came here by the level of prejudice against migrants. Now, originally she went up to Birmingham and worked with textile workers up there, but then she found her way back down to East London and worked with Darcus Howe and Terry Fitzpatrick at forming a vigilante group to protect the community from racist attacks. Because what was happening at this time, where you had these immigrants coming in and the council were housing them often by themselves on these white housing estates, and they were just being targeted constantly for racial abuse and attacks and violence. And what this group started to say was, like, you can't just, the level of racism in this country means that you can't be housing these people by themselves. It's not safe. They need to be together as a community. So they founded the Bengali Action Group, and they started sourcing empty council flats for homeless Bangladeshis, because that was the other thing. If the families were experiencing racist abuse and violence, they may leave the house because they felt it was unsafe, but then they would have been made themselves intentionally homeless. Just the council behaving appallingly, basically. So this group stepped in and they found these empty council flats for them in areas that were safer, and they actually drew up a map for Greater London. For the Greater London Council, defining a safe living area for the community. And this is how Brick Lane became established as the Bangladeshi heartland of Britain. So this is a quote that many of you may have seen before. The women in the picture are Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenny. to leading suffragettes you've probably heard of. The quote is actually from someone called Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and it's very famous, but I'm not sure that I actually agree with it, because I think you can make huge change by doing quiet and gentle things. And that's what we found in our research of women, is that they're particularly good at this. And so I want to sort of move on now to talking about ways that women have changed society in quieter, more subtle ways. So this is Annie Brax, and she changed lives by changing locks. She was one of the few women members of the Gay Liberation Front in London when it formed in 1970. And she was particularly interested in communal living, where, quote, children were the shared responsibility of the group and no gender role system would operate. And so what a lot of queer women did was they set up women-only squats, and Hackney was actually a haven for these women-only squats. And although not all of them were lesbian households, many of them were. So they served a practical purpose, which was, at the time, there was this real housing crisis, there was a lack of housing, while there was also a lot of empty properties standing vacant. So they were dealing with the practical question of that. But also, if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you will be more likely to be rejected by landlords, vilified, or even beaten up in your quest for a home. So Annie and many other queer women at the time would source empty houses and then do them up and run them as women-only communes. And actually they did such a great job of doing these up, because these were the houses that were laying in ruin, that the neighbours would actually alert the lesbians to empty houses in their street, because for them it was better that they would prefer to have someone come and squat there who was going to do the place up than have this derelict, rat-infested house next to them. So Annie said that the collective action of changing locks on a squat became a highly symbolic act. So that's an example of sort of like non-shouty, demonstration-y activism that really changed lives. So we're moving into more contemporary times now. This is Rachel Summers from Walthamstow. Rachel is a forest school leader, but also is a climate change activist. She is a member of Extinction Rebellion. But the reason that I've included her in this project, and why I want to talk to her about today, is because of what she did with a piece of land in Walthamstow. So Rachel's always loved being outside. As a child, she would take snails for a ride on her trike and had a tank of pet woodlice. She was trained as a forest school leader and discovered a piece of derelict land, which was supposed to be a conservation area, but was actually just sort of overrun with needles and dog poo and signs of rough sleepers. So she started hassling the council. And after an awful lot of hassling, she managed to get them to first give her permission to run her forest school there, but also they came in and tidied the place up a bit, because initially Rachel was having to go in before every session and clearing up all the needles and broken glass and all the rest of it. But eventually she got them doing that. They chopping back trees, creating clear spaces, and eventually they started commissioning the sculptures and artwork that you can see in this photo here. And she said after a while, she would go down to set up a forest school and she would see signs of people having been there before her that hadn't been part of her forest school. So in other words, people had started to come and use the space themselves. It wasn't just a space she was using it. So she opened it up to the community. And I should just add on a personal note, during lockdown, this space has been amazing because it is so peaceful down there. And there's, you know, you can go down there and practice social distancing, but there's people milling in and out, and that didn't exist before Rachel. And I'm personally very glad to have someone who transforms spaces. If you're going into lockdown, go into lockdown in a community with someone who transforms derelict spaces, because it's amazing. One of the reasons she did all this, she obviously believes in transforming spaces and outdoor learning and all the rest of it. But her key thing is that she said that research shows that you can take a group of children who are 8, 9 and 10 and sit them in a classroom and tell them all about plastics in the sea and climate change and isn't it all bad, but it actually makes very little difference to their behaviour as adults. Whereas if you actually take children the same age into these spaces that she's created, get them playing with mud, getting them identifying bird sounds, getting them identifying trees and flowers, they grow to love it. And then they grow up wanting to protect it because they love it so much. So it's no, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's no coincidence that Rachel is a member of Extinction Rebellion, and she's been involved in a number of actions with them, and she also helped her children organise their own school strike as a small act of revolution in our own community. Our next woman is Amanda Elliott, and she changed lives by changing how others see themselves. So Amanda Elliott is a rather seasoned activist. She has always been quite politically aware, but it was her son Callum being diagnosed as autistic which most shaped her activism. She formed a parent carer forum, so that's parents of disabled children. So she created a forum for them to come together to break isolation and provide information and support on legal rights and benefits. And the forum works very closely, there are forums all over the country, and they normally work very closely with the local council. But when austerity really started to bite, she could see that the council was starting to act against the needs of the forum instead of alongside them. And so she organised other parents like herself in opposition, and they started putting on demonstrations, they started petitions, and when this didn't do any good, they actually launched legal action. And I think that legal action they lost their first case, but it's actually at the Court of Appeal at the moment. So they're opposing cuts to special educational needs funding. So she has really helped a new generation of mainly women parents who've never done anything political before. She brought them together, she gave them helped them find their political voice, and she put disability rights back on the agenda, because really until the last sort of few years, disability activism had been sort of slipping out of, there was a real surge of it in the 90s, but since then it's sort of really been slipping from people's minds. And along with sort of other actions against austerity, sort of in the adult world, this fight against attacks on disabled children's legal rights has really given birth to this rebirth, I should say, to this movement again. And Amanda is one of the people who's really been helping parents to do that. Our next woman is Eva Slawson, and she changed lives by being herself. So Eva was born at the turn of the last century, and we, as I mentioned before, that we have been researching queer women activists, and it's actually quite hard to do that before 1969, because women simply didn't define themselves in those terms. The word lesbian didn't even really exist, and it's quite difficult to look back with a sort of modern lens and ascertain exactly whether these relationships, what they were. But Eva is the one person we have most evidence for her relationship with a woman called Mina Simmons as certainly been against heteronormative standards, and probably was a lesbian relationship. So what we know about Eva was that she was a socialist and a suffragette, and she was interested in feminist issues, particularly about the relationship between men and women. And in 1911, she met Mina Simmons and moved into her house in Walthamstow. Now, she doesn't openly describe her relationship in sexual terms, but it was clearly very profound. We know we have letters and diary entries, and we know from that it was clearly very profound and intense. So there are other women that we found that sort of fall into this category of rejecting heteronormative lifestyles, and they include suffragette Mary Lee, May Morris, William Morris's daughter, and Louisa Martindale from Leighton, whose mother was a leading suffragette, and Louisa herself was a surgical pioneer. So I kind of frame these women as they rejected marriage and children, and they were brave enough to be themselves at a time where that was enormously difficult. You took huge risks, and I think in their own quiet way they really did pave the way for the later movements. So when I was doing this presentation before lockdown, it actually ended there, but I just kind of feel that in the light of everything that's been happening in the last few weeks, I really wanted to say something about Black Lives Matters, and I've been kind of searching my own soul about, you know, what my contribution to this could be, and how I can be sort of a good ally and stand in solidarity with what people are doing. And I feel that one way white historians can do this is by amplifying the stories of Black activists. And Zita Holborn, who features in our project, do go onto our website to hear more about her story. But she says, amplifying voices of those who face discrimination is in itself an act of resistance. It means our voices, our lives, and our perspectives are out there. And so that's what I feel that I want to do right now. And I have been seeing some people sort of sharing stories of white male anti-slavery abolitionists, and they're interesting stories, but what I think we need to be doing now is sharing these women's stories. So I just want to spend a little bit of a moment, I kind of started thinking about, well, who should I talk about? Should I talk about Zita? Should I talk about Diane Abbott? It's 33 years this year when Diane won her historic election in Hackney that made her the first Black woman MP. But I just thought, why focus it on just a single person? And so what I want to do is just run through a few of the women in our project. And I'm afraid for time, I will have to go through it quite quickly, but I hope that you'll be interested enough and then go and read more fully about their stories in our research and our research report, which is on our website, eastlondonwomen.org.uk. So starting on the top left, this is Karpal Kaur Sandhu, and she became the world's first Asian woman police officer in 1971, and she served in Walthamstow and Leighton. So she beat the system in making it to this position, and there's no kind of record of the oppression that she faced in getting there. So, you know, but I think we can imagine, right? But unfortunately, she did not survive her husband, who was enraged by her taking this job. And first of all, he took her children away from her. And then he came back to the house where they had lived together, and he murdered her. Sorry, this is about, I just suddenly realised as I said it what a downer start to this is, but she was so important, I think, and she paved the way for other women of colour to enter the police force. So next along from Karpal is the Sari Squad. And they were a direct action group opposing racist legislation in the 1980s. They were opposing, what they were opposing was not that dissimilar to what we see today with the Immigration Act and the hostile environment. They particularly rallied around a case of Afia Begum, who was facing deportation after the death of her husband. But they insisted that there were many more like her who were being systematically abused. So that next to her on our far right, we have Julie Begum, and she was the founder of, or co-founder of Women Unite Against Racism, which formed following the murder of Altif Ali in order to provide a unique space for women to campaign. Because what they found was that in the anti-racism groups that formed after Altif Ali's death, that men were really dominating. So she created this unique space for women. They focused particularly on preventing the re-election of Derek Beckton, in the 1994 local elections in Tower Hamlets, and they were very successful in that he lost his seat. Over in the bottom left here, we have Shonali Bhattacharya, who is one of the most prolific activists out there, and there's a really stiff competition for that. I've tried to sort of sum up the huge range of stuff that she's done, and this is only some of it. So she has campaigned against deaths in custody, she's battled imperialism with groups like Stop the War and Palestine Solidarity, and more recently she's been fighting the hostile environment and is an active member of Wolf and Forest Black Lives Matter. So she's been organising, she seems to be non-stop at the moment, organising protests across the borough in response to George Floyd's death. And finally, as I mentioned before, Zita Holborn, another very prolific woman, co-founded anti-austerity group Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, the movement against xenophobia. She campaigned against the immigration bill and set up BAME Lawyers for Justice in response to the Windrush scandal. That was a particular fallout of the Immigration Act legislation, was the Windrush scandal. And if that wasn't also enough to keep her busy, she is also a trade unionist, a poet, artist, and author. So in conclusion, as I said, women rarely make history, but this is changing because women are forcing it to. So we are seeing more books written about women, more statues and plaques going up of women, more just recognition that women are being forgotten about, and that has to change. But while that is all changing, I do still feel that there is a focus on particular groups of women, and these are normally the white middle class women. And we need to make sure that ordinary women get recognised as well, because they do change lives too. And also, we do not need to always behave badly to make change, although of course it can help. And certainly what we're seeing right now is that a lot of activists of colour feel that they have no other choice but to do this because everything else has failed. But I think there are lots of small ways that people do make a difference to people's lives, and that women are particularly good at that. And I think we also have to remember that we need to find a space and recognition for the introverted and quiet activists. We are living through extraordinary times, but the crisis that has been erupting is allowing for conversations around Black voices and Black experiences that were not previously heard. And I think particularly all the discussions that we're now having around things like statues that have been happening in niches, in historical circles, the fact that they are now being discussed in mainstream media, I think is really positive, and I hope that we can keep this energy going. So I'm going to exit out of this slideshow now, hopefully. And I'll take everyone off mute. And then if you have any questions, you can either just shout them out, or you can... Oh, there's a few questions here already, so I'm going to, Eva's last name is Eva Slawson. What's the website address? It's eastlondonwomen.org.uk, and you will find on there the exhibition that was supposed to be happening in our in community centres around the country, around East London. And yeah, so you'll see that exhibition there. There should be, if it's not already up, it should be up by Monday. Some audio clips from the oral histories that we collected have been added to that exhibition. I'm very excited to say that we have a new podcast series launching soon, hopefully this summer. And we also, for any teachers who might be out there, are developing some home learning resources for Key Stage 3 they're aimed at. There's also, I mentioned before, the report, which is the most in-depth look at the women that we've discussed, because always with exhibitions and talks, you have to kind of filter out a lot of people that you would like to include because there's just not time. So Linda just says she's off. Okay, thank you, Linda, for joining. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Is there any other questions?
Yes.
Yes, Laura?
Yes. I just, sorry, I've gone and lost your images now. Never mind. I just wanted you to draw attention vis-a-vis the Matchwomen, as you're calling them, the matchers. Sarah Chapman is putting up a campaign, as you well may know, to stop them mounding, what's called mounding, the grave of Sarah Chapman. And she needs all the support she can get.
Yes, yes, that's a really good point.
Yes, I have a website. I can read it out. I've lost your picture at the moment. I don't know why. Oh no, there we are. Here I am. Do you want me to read it out or put it on the chat line?
Why don't you, could you do both?
Well, all right, I'll read it while I'm here.
Okay.
Her surname is Dearman. So it's SAMDEARMAN 0411 @gmail.com. That's Sam Dearman, that's a woman. Sam, presumably short for Samantha. Sam Dearman, and she is desperately trying to get people to write to their MPs and Forestgate Council because they're going to mound over the grave of Sarah Chapman.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and Sam is, I think, is she the great-granddaughter of Sarah Chapman?
Yeah. I mean, I won't stick my neck out, but yes, she's a relative. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was very helpful with this project actually, and gave you some of those photos. Yeah, please do support that. It is a really important project. It would be really nice to preserve that grave because she isn't mentioned. There's a blue plaque on Bow Quarter, which is where the Bryanton May factory was. There is a blue plaque, but that is dedicated to Annie Besant.
I live around the corner from the Fairfield Road where the was.
Yeah, great.
Inbar has a question.
Someone else have a question? Sorry.
Inbar.
Oh, Inbar. Hi, Inbar. What's your question? Can't hear. Are you on mute? No.
Still can't hear. Come closer. No.
You can always write it in the chat.
Well, I can ask a question, sir. Esther, are you likely to extend the project to East London women who are specifically involved in the international environmental movement? Talking about, I don't know, fashion industry and Bangladeshi women. You know, there are all sorts of angles to this.
Yeah, there's no specific plans. We did have about 7 or 8 themes that we've focused on, and some of those women have been involved in international work. For example, I mentioned Shonali, who's been involved in sort of Palestine solidarity and Stop the War. We have tended to focus on domestic stuff, but it's an interesting question. It's not completely sort of beyond the realms. I mean, what I generally find is that a lot of women are just passionate about lots of issues. So there were very few that just put themselves in one box. So it might be that they fit in many different boxes, and things like sort of, international developmental issues could come in as well. Any other questions?
There's Imba says, can you please put the information above to the event page as well?
Which was the Which information is that? I'm not sure what
That's
information
the
that is.
Roland's computer.
Yeah. Oh, well, you mean about Sarah Chapman's? Oh yes, about Sarah Chapman. Yeah, there's something on my Facebook page, but I will reshare that, and maybe I will put it in the, because I'm going to share this video for people who couldn't make it today.
Yeah.
So I
just put, once again, I put it twice by accident.
Yeah.
And then somebody else asks, Roland asks, and then I've said Hull State Council, yeah. And you can find there's a website, yeah.
No, about this project. So yeah, this video will go up. I'll probably stick it on YouTube, and we can put more details about this project. Let me just put the. I'm just going to. I've just put the website for this project in the chat, and I will link to all these different things in the descriptor of the when the video goes online.
Just one question here, Esther.
Yeah.
Just sort of looking at how sort of with the internet age, I was just sort of thinking how sort of the internet will enable women activist stories that have previously been hidden be discovered, but also going forward into the future, hopefully the internet means that women's stories will be there and much more accessible than they have been in the past when we've had to go looking through archives and things like that.
Yeah, I feel this is a bit of a sort of double-edged sword, though. I think you're right, but there hasn't been a lot of work around kind of preserving some of this sort of digital data, like and things like Twitter. I mean, I was just reading now a very long Twitter thread from someone who was on a Black Lives demonstration yesterday, which was like eyewitness reports of how particularly Black activists were being treated by the police, and it was an astonishing bit of sort of reportage that was all done on Twitter. But you know, what is being done to preserve those? And Twitter moves so fast, it's so busy, it's so noisy, it's just gonna, you know, next week it will be lost because no one's actually preserving it. So the other thing is, of course, that women are able to speak to much larger groups of people more quickly, but that does not come up, that comes at a price as well. Zita actually talks in her interview, and again you can find that on our website, eastlondonwomen.org.uk, about the amount of abuse that women, but particularly Black women, have to endure on social media because, and she said, it's people's way of telling us that they don't want our voices heard. So, so it is a mix of opportunity and threat, I suppose, and it's quite a hard balance, I think, at the moment. It would really be good to see the social media companies step up a bit more and take more action on this, and the police actually, because Zita went to the police because she received death threats and rape threats and threats to her family, and the police just said they can't do anything about it. And I've heard someone else recently, exactly the same thing happened to him when he started getting racist abuse. He went to, and threats, actual death threats, and he went to the police and they said they couldn't do anything. So yeah, it's I mean, I hope kind of being able to collect things online, and one of the reasons we did this project was because these stories were not catalogued, they weren't collected together, and that's what we wanted to do. And now we have collected this online resource. We hope that that will be available for future generations to be able to more easily access it. Yeah.
Esther, I wonder whether you heard of the first neighbourhood cooperative nursery and the project that we did last year in Walthamstow, which culminated in the exhibition at the Mill. So why I'm saying is that there is a bit of information online on the record website, but that was a very sort of unique and very feminist project, and it was local. But what I'm saying is that there is the whole archive that was actually collected during that project is now in the Bishopsgate Institute archive, and it is available for researchers. And it's a huge archive that we managed to collect, and it might be, I wonder whether that might be possible for your project to discuss with Bishopsgate, because they are brilliant as an archive collecting local histories.
Yeah, our archive is also at Bishopsgate. So what you have on our website is still a kind of curation of everything, but all our oral history interviews in their entirety with their transcripts all go there. They also, the Waltham Forest ones also go to the Waltham Forest Oral History Workshop archive. So we have those archived in 2 places. But you have Linda, who was involved in that project, was actually involved in this project as well. And we do have a resources section on our website, and I should put that on there actually, because you're right, it is linked. And so yeah, thank you thank you for making me think of it. I'll stick a link to the 2. Yeah, brilliant. Any other questions? Yes, the Chainmaker Festival is happening this year. Thank you, Roland or Imba. I'm not quite sure who wrote that, but yeah, if you could put it on the event page, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm actually also doing some work around equal pay, and I've been doing some work around the Chainmaker strike as well. So it all kind of, yeah, it all links up, all very interesting stuff. Yes, hello.
Nora.
Nora, yeah, your name did pop up.
Oh, right, how strange. Well, once again, well, what I'm saying is with great sensitivity, but I'm going to bring up Susan Croft and Suffrage Arts, yes?
Okay.
So people know about her work and endeavour to do with recording alternative theatre history from the 80s onwards, but also suffrage arts. But this is just an opportunity for people to express themselves. There is something called, one word, Her Inside Stories .wordpress, and women, well, yes, it is women, are invited to record or write stories about their experience recently during lockdown. And you can, so do you want me to put that on the thing?
Yeah, that'd be great, yeah.
I mean, it's just that it's another way. The reason isn't that I am promoting it, you know, like some competitive situation. It's just, it's another way of bringing women together.
Yeah.
And you know, getting the networks overlapping and sharing. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's all about sharing and connecting, so that's great. Also, Tower Hamlets Archives are asking for any resources, not just about women, just generally, anything that people are collecting during lockdown, whether it's art or diary entries or anything like that. They've
this will be sort of women's experience oriented. So in consequence, you know, like you were saying, in years to come, it becomes a resource from which people draw.
Yeah, that's great.
You know, for future history.
Yeah, and we were actually I was discussing with the board of directors of our organisation about there's actually a new layer of activism that's happening at the moment from the Black Lives Matters movement, but also just the mutual aid groups I think are very interesting, and all the PPE campaigns, you know, and so many of these I'm noticing are being fronted by women. So yeah, it's women keep being on the front line of these things. Any other questions or things that people want to flag or thoughts that they had during the presentation?
I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thanks, Eva.
It's interesting and it's great.
Oh,
great that you exist. It's really great.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So in that case, I think it's time just to say thank you all very much for coming today. And just another reminder that the website is eastlondonwomen.org.uk. We are also on Facebook, at Women Activists of East London. You can find us there. I'm always sharing sort of interesting stories that I kind of find online, as well as sort of information about what we're doing. And we're also on Instagram, if anyone does that, at share.uk, and on Twitter at share_UK. So I will just leave that by saying thank you once again for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esther.
Bye.
Thank you, Esther.
Bye-bye.